In this video, we're going to learn what an inverse function is. Here, I have just started with a simple function, f of x is equal to x plus 7. And we're just going to look at what happens when we drop inputs into that function. I've drawn a diagram here of a function machine. Essentially, it's just like substituting into a function. So let's say we decide to input, say, a 3 into this function. And this is just an arbitrary number that I chose. So we take 3, we plug it into this function, and this function adds 7 to the 3. So out comes a 10. So an inverse function undoes what an original function does to our input. So our input of 3, 7 was added to that. So our inverse function is going to take that 7 away, and we're going to end up with what we started with. So if you input a 3 into a function, and then you take the output of that function, and then you input that output into the inverse function, which is this function right here, you will get back what you started with. So let's take a look at this function and just try to figure out, well, what is the inverse function? Well, if our simple function is just adding 7 to our input, then our inverse function is just taking that 7 away. So our inverse function is just subtracting 7 from our input. The one thing that is confusing is what was the output of the original function becomes the input of the inverse function. But we see the idea, okay? So let's take a different function. Let's just clean this up a little bit. Okay, let's take another function. We'll say it's 2x plus 6. Okay, so let's clean this up. We know we're probably not going to get a 10 out. We don't know that, but we probably won't. But let's start off with inputting 3 again. We know that if we input 3 into this function, something is going to come out. Some output is going to come out right here. We may not know what it is. Something is going to come out. And then we're going to take that output and we're going to stick it into the inverse function. And we know that we're going to get a 3 out. Right? Because we have to get what we started with. The inverse function undoes the original function. So we take our 3, we plug it into this function. Remember, this is 2x plus 6. So if we are going to, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. If we're going to substitute 3 into 2x plus 6, let's follow the order of operations and see what happens to that 3. The first thing that happens to that input is it gets multiplied by 2 and becomes a 6. Then, following the order of operations, we add 6 to it. So 3 times 2 is 6, plus 6 is 12. So we get an output of 12. Now, what does the inverse function do? Well, the inverse function does the opposite of what just happened. Okay, so, oops, there we go. So our input was multiplied by 2, and then we added 6 to it. So now the inverse function is going to do the opposite operation, also in the opposite order. Okay, so we know instead of multiplying by 2, it's going to divide by 2. And then we know instead of adding 6, it's going to subtract 6. But it has to occur in the opposite order. So now our new input, it is going to be subtracted by 6, and then it's going to be divided by 2. Okay, opposite operations in reverse order. So we're going to take this 12, we're going to subtract 6 from it, and then we're going to divide that by 2. 12 minus 6 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and that is what we started with. Okay, so some things I want to point out here. Okay, if we have an original function and our inputs result in outputs. And then we have an inverse function. And the inputs into our inverse function were the outputs from the original function. You could almost think of our original outputs as now being our inputs, and the new output were the original inputs. Okay? So, if we can use some math terminology here, the set of all inputs is our domain for our original function. The set of all outputs is our range. Okay, now, the new domain was the old range. This is our new domain, or the domain for the inverse function. And our new range was our domain for the original function. So this domain for our original function now is our range for our inverse function. And the range for our original function becomes our domain for our inverse function. Okay, so to make a long story short, the domain and range swap. So the domain and range swap when going from your original function to your inverse function. Okay, so there are more points that I'm going to make about inverse functions in upcoming videos, but this is a basis for the concept of the idea behind an inverse function.